right, so today we're looking at The Difficulty of Kindness, Boundaries, Time, and the Ordinary by Clara Hahn, which appears in The Ground Between, Anthropologists Engage Philosophy. So in this very fine-grained description of how acts of kindness appear in subtle, disguised, concealed ways in La Pincoya, Clara Hahn shows that the everyday is not transparent in the very acts and expression of care that cement and maintain social relations, comity, that they can only do their work by remaining nebulous. So it seems very counterintuitive in some ways. Maintaining a future together then remains not on transparency, but rather on murkiness in the ordinary exercises of kindness. Here we're going to see both why the everyday is not simply the given and taken for granted, but is an often fragile achievement. And we can see how this community undertakes to achieve it. So I just want to be sure I'm clear with that. The contrast is between imagining the everyday as the zone of taken for grantedness, where everything is obvious, laid out, versus the everyday as an achievement, therefore as something that requires work. So here we see La Pincoya is in the very northern part of Santiago de Chile, on the Pacific coast of South America. All right, Hahn opens her essay with two provocative and enigmatic claims, and it's going to take really the bulk of the paper to explore these thoroughly. One is that kindness and acknowledgement of hardship in La Pincoya rest on both attentiveness and forgetfulness, which we'll see involves the exercise of pretending, concealment of one's knowledge and of one's motivations. Second, she notes that the goal of her essay is to explore how we might think of the everyday as an achievement. Again, going back to this notion that the everyday is not what you can take for granted. It's not simply the safe, the reliable, what is always there for you, but rather it has this notion of something achieved. The two strands of thinking are linked here. These two strands being the one, kindness and acknowledgement, relying on attentiveness and forgetfulness, and then the second, the everyday is an achievement, these two things. So these two strains are linked, as we'll see, that our understanding of the first, how kindness requires forms of benevolent dissimulation, reveals the second, not only how the everyday is an achievement, but what sorts of threats specific to La Pincoya may unravel it. So then we get another element here, right, of the everyday as fragile. So not only is it something that is an achievement that requires a work to achieve, or continuous work to achieve, but also it is something vulnerable. It can unravel. Maybe this seems counterintuitive. Hahn finds in La Pincoya that kindness can only be kind if it hides itself, if it does not appear as kindness, but rather as something else. And that the achievement of the ordinary, or of the everyday, in some way depends on the daily renewal of this kindness that pretends not to be kindness. To provide herself and her readers with a clear vantage point, Hahn takes up a body of scholarship that is close to the topic of kindness. We might call it a neighboring discourse. And this is the work on critical humanitarian aid, which has built up a substantial body of literature. So in that literature, one of the things that we learn is that humanitarian aid takes the form of a gift that the recipient cannot reciprocate. So on the one hand, then, we all know from our involvement in circuits of gift exchange, birthdays, festive occasions, what have you, that when you receive a gift, along with the gift you receive a debt. You have to repay this debt at a roughly timed interval with a roughly equivalent gift. If you don't do that, if you delay too long, or if you are too hasty in reciprocating with the gift, then your gift exchange partner may either feel that you don't trust the sincerity of the gift that you received, or that you take it for granted if you take too long to return it. Also, of course, it has to have a notion of rough equivalence, however you want to measure that. Humanitarian aid, so the argument goes, does not allow the recipients to free themselves of the debt that corresponds to the gift of aid. So it's this deeply asymmetrical kind of gifting. Han then contrasts her own work on kindness with this work that describes the politicization of compassion in the present, by pointing to a way that kindness responds not to the present, this kind of amorphous generic notion, but rather to another's present. So the present specific to that individual. And in doing this, it's organized around acknowledgement, acknowledging the specifics of this other's present, and is situated in everyday life. So on all of these markers, it kind of deviates from the literature on humanitarian aid. Kindness appears then in response to what Han calls critical moments. So just a quick word, these are not then to be confused with something like the critical events that we find in Vinadasa's work. Rather, they're of the nature of having the electricity cut off for lack of payment, a household dispute that maybe becomes detectable by one's neighbors, things of this sort. So I said that not because Han downplays the importance of these moments, but rather to give a sense of the scale of these moments. So then, in circumstances of precarious income, perpetual debt, poverty, households can experience moments of scarcity and crisis in ways that friends and neighbors might witness, and to which neighbors and friends may respond with kindness. Extending kindness, though, this is delicate work, especially given the historic shift in Chile to insist on citizenship with its corresponding rights. So then to demand that I be recognized as a citizen, and as a citizen, I demand recognition of my rights. And that is not the same thing as demanding or requesting charity. In fact, it is something of the opposite. It eschews charity. So then charity historically became a target of resentment and hostility. People experienced the receiving charity or the offer of charity as an attack on their dignity, and when others received it, as something disdainful, that it's a devaluation of oneself. Friendship or neighborliness in La Pincoya then demanded attentiveness, being present, but acts of kindness also have to be given without even a whiff, the faintest hint of charity to them. Why? Because giving something that you present as a form of charity denigrates your friend. It diminishes your friend's dignity. That would be inattentive on your part. So then Han poses this problem of boundaries. Shame, she says, shadows the boundary between asking and begging. And this tremendous delicacy and energy must be devoted to maintaining these boundaries on both sides, right? On the recipient side, you don't want to be seen to be begging, because then you're inviting people to look on you with disdain. In giving, in extending kindness, you don't want to appear to be treating your friend as a charity case because of the implications that would have for your friend's dignity. It's important then that by extension of kindness, let me start that again. It's important then that the extension of kindness is not simply episodic, that is organized around discrete events, but is reciprocal in nature. So that if we were to go back to the contrast with humanitarian aid, which may be episodic but is not reciprocal, we can see that the extension of kindness is a different kind of a thing. She says, through acts of reciprocity that constantly stabilize a woman's enduring, critical moments are quietly contended with and contained among kin and friends, shoring up moral boundaries when faced with hardship's corrosive potential. And this is a tricky thing. Kindness as reciprocal sounds like there's this sort of serial quality to it. So reciprocation unfolds over time, and it has the structure of I give, you give back, I give back, you give back, and so on and so forth. Han, however, says that we can understand kindness in terms of vertical time, which he characterizes as co-occurring or contemporaneous acts, moments, and circumstances that are involved in kindness. What does this mean? Well, it means that kindness works through simultaneous attentiveness and forgetfulness. I notice your critical moment and I forget it. It is not something that leaves, so to speak, a residue on me. I delete it, in a sense, from my memory. This is, in a way, how our future together can move forward. So then we can think of the act or as attentiveness and forgetfulness, not as happening one after the other, but as sort of layered or lining one another. Again, simultaneous rather than sequential. Now, it seems to me that one of the things that Han points to is how the women she discusses secure, or in the case of Paloma, failed to secure a future together, and that the accumulation of goodwill or ill will over time, especially as the latter appears in gossip, as ill will appears in gossip, that too can be decisive, so that there are different temporalities here. Vertical temporality is one in the act of kindness, but that there is also this kind of what we might call diachronic, that it unfolds over time. Now, having said this, kindness does not occur only in vertical time, and how one reacts to catching another's critical moment, that is, becoming aware of, both responds to and constitutes the sort of relationship that you have with that person. A neighbor may catch a critical moment, but not respond to it as a friend would. Well, what does this mean? Han says, the crucial difference between inhabiting friendship and neighborliness lay not in the perceptive activity of catching those signs of critical moments, but in how that catching would or could be addressed. In friendship, asking and giving occur in a modality of reciprocity, of mutual obligations that carry a relation forward in time and in which personal intimacies are shared. On the one side, then, we have this desire to endure, attached to a notion of dignity, to meet life's hardships with dignity. At the same time, though, these signs of hardship can still seep out, can still, say, escape the household or kinship relations or whatever sort of unit of privacy you may have. So Han says, a child's cry from hunger, the visit from a debt collector, the electricity cut, a domestic fight over bills spills into the street. All of these ways that hardship can seep out and, in a sense, something private become publicly detectable. Critical moments, then, may not remain private, and neighbors may be made aware of your need for help. It's important to note here, I think, that what Han is describing is not a request for aid, but rather it's something that the individuals may wish to maintain privately that escapes that privacy, and by virtue of that becomes noticeable by one's friends and neighbors. Now, responding to the seepage one catches as a neighbor or as a friend, this requires delicacy. So performing an act of kindness requires that you conceal both the critical moment that you've witnessed. So this is the element of forgetfulness, and the act of giving you've undertaken in response. And so this means obscuring your offer of kindness so that it doesn't appear as an offer of kindness. It appears as something that hasn't got, as I say, even a whiff of charity attached to it. This means then there's just no room to make a grand gesture. Acts of kindness have to be meaningfully helpful, of course, but also just quotidian enough to appear completely unexceptional. So sharing food, helping with sewing, picking children up from school, acknowledging hardship or need, but without directing attention to the hardship or need. The tact and delicacy of the acts of kindness Han describes signal the seriousness with which people in Lapinkoya treat others' critical moments, and, Han points out, give us insight into the kind of threats critical moments pose to everyday life. Now, this, to my mind, harkens back to something in Veena Das's work, and from the philosophy of Stanley Cavell, for that matter, where the difficulty of pinning down what the everyday or what the ordinary is has this counterpart, that one of the ways that it becomes recognizable to us, visible to us, is through the things that threaten it. So these critical moments then are the sort of thing that bring the everyday into relief, exactly because it reveals the vulnerability of the everyday to them. Now, Han, though, first wants to direct her attention to ways that Austen's essay, Pretending, can just deepen our understanding of the gifts, the acts of kindness that she's described. She starts out with how that draws attention to this notion of vertical time, or the co-occurrence of acts in the gift. She writes, this is from Austen now. I must be trying to make others believe or give them the impression by means of personal performance in their presence that I am really only, etc., ABC, in order to disguise the fact that I am really XYZ. Then he goes on to capture this principle in a single line. In pretending, contemporary behavior misleads as to contemporary fact. So again, these things are simultaneous, layered on one another. All right, so then how does this apply to Lapinkoya? Han explains. Features of pretending that Austin emphasizes include being in the other's presence, right? So the idea of another's present, and the contemporaneous appearing as, while in fact being something else, concealed. Rather than the tempo of gift and counter gift, there's an act that is the concealment of another synchronous act. Now, following from this, Han raises the question of what the work of concealment in pretending might protect or permit in everyday life. We should recall that, according to Han, what is concealed is not only the giving, but also the neighbor's catching of the critical moment, attentiveness and forgetfulness. Concealing allows for the enduring to endure. The threat within the everyday is the threat to living with dignity. Avoiding explicit recognition of the critical moment and one's resulting act of kindness protects life with dignity, right? So again, when we think about what I was just saying a moment ago, we can understand the constitution of the everyday through the threats to it. And this idea of dignity threatened by the appearance of accepting charity is central to the constitution of the everyday in Lapinkoya. Now, an important effect of taking pretending seriously from Austin's essay is that it allows us to shift our attention from a picture of the poor as perpetually, this is quoting Han now, struggling for recognition in a world of hierarchical identities, and towards the subtle work of understanding kindness with its currents of remembering and forgetting, attentiveness and forgetting, directed at supporting one another's dignity. So then finally, pretending reveals the moral energy in remaining silent about how and when one cares for others. Those are Han's words. Words here then have devastating revelatory potential, right? Because exposing in too public a way, say through a grand gesture, another's hardship and struggle would be devastating. Remaining alert to the potential for pretending to shroud a critical moment in an enabling silence and obscurity even redirects our attention to the, as she says, almost imperceptible, quiet moral striving of acts of kindness that present themselves as something else. We might then revisit the gossip about Palama's willingness to take without contributing and her subsequent marginalization. That could provide kind of the flip side of this quiet moral striving, the revelatory potential that words can have. What Han points to here is that getting a grip on what's going on in Lapinkoya as these women and their families experience critical moments doesn't come from escaping the particularities of the everyday in order, say, to develop a 30,000 foot view of them, but rather from delving deeper into the everyday. So then her task is not to abstract out a general self cobbled together from various examples of people struggling with crushing debt and precarious lives, but rather to respond to their tasks in making this world their own. What Cavell would characterize then as having a voice in their own history. Han attunes herself to the ways in which the women of Lapinkoya, who she studied, maintain attentiveness within a world. So not the world as an abstraction, but a world, the world in which they co-create everyday life. And they place themselves in the present and presence of friends and neighbors in crisis. Now, a feature of sociality that has been in the background throughout Han's paper now becomes easier to get into focus. Making the other present to me and myself present to the other depends upon acknowledging our separateness. Failing or declining to acknowledge our separateness renders the other as a fictitious character, a figment of my own imagination. That necessarily denies the other's own sense of self, autonomy, and indeed dignity. To get a bit of traction with these things, being present, separateness, Han turns to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher, phenomenologist, whose contribution to phenomenology has probably had the greatest presence within anthropologists of any of the major figures in phenomenology. In the Phenomenology of Perception, which is Merleau-Ponty's masterwork, as well as in the essay that Han cites, Merleau-Ponty argues that the subject does not possess, but is possessed by objects. So immediately, this might sound like a strange and again counterintuitive thing to say. Merleau-Ponty takes the example of a sonata and talks then about how the sonata possesses the musician, not the other way around. In this way, the musician only becomes that sort of subject, a musical performer, in light of the sonata. Now we can see how this applies to the self and the other. So just as we are not subjects, first and foremost and independently subjects, who may, as subjects, possess or appropriate objects, but rather we are subjects by virtue of the way that objects possess us, the same thing holds for others. So I'm not a standalone subject who apprehends a standalone other, another subject. Rather, it's only in virtue of the other that I am a subject. So in Lapinkoya, we can see that this is not... we can see that one is not responsive because one is a friend. So a certain kind of subject. You are the kind of subject who is a friend and who thereby acts accordingly as that kind of subject. Rather, it's the other way around. One is a friend because of one's responsiveness upon catching the seepage of a critical moment, for example. Now, I hope that this makes it clear why this sort of insight is valuable for anthropology. The specificity of one's subjectivity arises from one's social relations, not independently of them. So it's not something that you bring to your social relations, it's something that you develop in your social relations. Hopefully also, this sharpens our sense of what is at stake in the relations Han describes. Responsiveness and deftly handled kindness that preserves both another's dignity and relieves the pressure of a critical moment make up one possible set of reactions. Of course, withholding them is another possibility. This is what Palama discovers. Withholding responsiveness the withholding responsiveness entails a kind of denial of the reality of others, as if their critical moments are not real for me, not mine to respond to with kindness, though perhaps I respond to them with gossip, as in the case of Paloma. Stanley Cavell, who Han cited earlier, poses the question of who are my others. Now, on my reading of Cavell, I think we can take this as a question not of who as others are alien to me, but who as my others are implicated in my everyday life and I in theirs. Denial of Paloma as my other, then, would be an ordinary thing to do, but also one that pushes her out of my everyday life and considerations in some particular sorts of ways. Here, then, is how Han characterizes the social world she's analyzed. It is a world in which a preoccupation with limits may be emphasizing not the integrity of identity as sovereign self, but rather the problems of responsiveness within and across the self's relational modes. In this world, kindness can't be taken as given. It's uncertain what constitutes a critical moment. Is that what I just caught? Is it a child crying out of hunger, or is it a child crying who just fell? Perhaps not a critical moment. Was that the debt collector who arrived at my neighbor's house, or was it, say, a relative from a neighboring town or city, or what have you? Critical moments are not transparent. Also, if another's actions occur in response to my critical moment, because kindness must be disguised in any case. They can't be overtly recognizable as acts of kindness. They have to be disguised. Was that an act of kindness that I received? I may be able to detect it as such. Maybe it's going to be too subtle. Nor is the future dependable. Maybe my neighbor, at the moment of my need and my struggle and suffering, is not going to be in a position right then to extend kindness to me. Maybe there will be things that are occupying my friend or neighbor that make that kind of responsiveness impossible in that moment. So then these, as I say, these are things that make the everyday an achievement rather than the given. Not a zone where things are simply reliable, given, taken for granted, but rather require this kind of continuous energy to achieve the everyday. So what in the end does all of this have to do with the everyday? If the everyday becomes visible to us in the threats to it and our reaction to those threats, what can we take away from Han's paper to help us think about the everyday? So she writes, between neighbors, there is a double sense to kindness. Just as those critical moments are concealed within a domestic scene, kindness is concealed by pretending. It occurs through achieving a likeness to everyday life while responding to it. The nature of kindness is therefore thoroughly entwined with boundaries in this world between friend and neighbor, home and the street, that inform the small but significant slip from asking to begging. But it is just as entwined with engaging those boundaries, shoring them up by subtly overcoming them in the face of another's critical moment. Taking another's vulnerability as mine to respond to, with all the delicacy such a response demands, this is a deeply ethical move. and one that reveals both how threats or vulnerabilities arise within the everyday, but the resources, perhaps practical but certainly ethical resources, are also available within the everyday. Where else would one find them anyway? Indeed, we see in La Pincoya that an effort to escape the everyday as a way of coping with others' critical moments would be to deny them as one's others, a sort of abandonment with enormous destructive potential. Indeed, this may be just the way that the everyday begin to unravel for people.